There's a moment in your life, at least once, when you experience pure terror, the kind that makes your chest feel hot yet frozen, trapping your last breath. Time seems to slow down, your stomach tightens, and a silent scream fills your throat. Maybe you run, maybe you freeze, or maybe you try to fight. But for those who felt true terror, it becomes etched deep in your bones, changing a part of your soul. With that said, I want to tell you about November 20th, 2006. I grew up in a strict Baptist Christian home, and at that time I was young and easily influenced. When you grow up in that environment, there's a lot of talk about heaven and angels, but also about the threat of hell and eternal damnation, which can be pretty terrifying for an 8-year-old. Anyway, my family and I took a trip to Colorado, where we rented a small cabin high in the mountains, deep in the woods. We were so high up that my dad needed portable oxygen due to the altitude. We were pretty isolated, except for another cabin about 3 acres away, though it was hard to see through the snow-covered trees and the foot-deep snow on the ground. Our first night was fun. We had a fire, roasted marshmallows, and made popcorn on long sticks. I had a good time, and my 2 younger sisters and I even built a snowman. The inside of the cabin was very open in design. There was a railing leading to a second-story loft with 2 twin beds. Under the stairs was where our dad's bed was. There was a small TV and an ugly blue floral couch that smelled like maple syrup. I slept on the left twin bed, closest to the edge and the stairs. My sister Bailey, who was 6, slept in the right bed, farther from the edge. Our youngest sister, Grace, who was only 2, slept with our dad downstairs. I slept well that night, probably the last good night's sleep I've had, and I'm 23 now. It all started with a tapping early the next morning. I woke up to this annoying tapping sound. It wasn't like a pencil tapping on a desk. It was more like the rough sound of something heavy and sharp clicking its nails against the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was my dad. Honestly, I thought it could be bears too. We were in the mountains after all, but I was wrong. The tapping sound made me stay completely still in my bed. I had a habit of sleeping with the pillow over my head, so I felt pretty hidden. I decided to peek through the small gap between my bed and the pillow. I looked toward the edge of the loft where someone had neglected to put a railing. I could see the straight drop-off to the living area and tiny kitchen below. The large, curtainless windows emphasized how alone we were in that cabin. How dark it was when you're miles away from city lights and surrounded by towering juniper and spruce trees. But there was something there, like a dark shape just on the overhang. It looked like a blurred hand, just a few fingers, black against the darkness, gripping the edge of the loft and tapping an extra-jointed finger. I froze, nausea and chills spreading through my body. I held my breath. No, I thought to myself, there's no way I'm seeing that. I slowly closed my eyes and turned away. It would be daylight soon. I usually woke up around 6 a.m., so there was no way I had to wait all night for Dad to get up and sing loudly to us, "Good morning, girls. Demons can't be real, monsters can't be real." I kept telling myself that. I was a God-fearing Christian. We sang hymns in the car every time we drove anywhere. We went to private Bible school and vacation Bible school. There was no way God would let that happen to one of his children, right? I kept repeating these thoughts over and over, whispering Bible verses in fear, so quietly they came out as breaths. Prayers and verses I hoped would make it go away. In my mind, I even commanded the thing to leave me alone. I didn't know any better, but I sure do now. After what felt like hours, but was most likely only a few minutes, I felt the air around me calm down a bit. The tension eased. I got brave and opened one eye as small as I could. It was gone. That weird hand, or whatever it was gone. It had left silently, and I hadn't even noticed. I breathed a sigh of relief and rolled over to face the wall beside me. There was a small wooden nightstand with an old oil lamp on it, but slightly hidden behind it was a small seam, like the outline of a tiny square door frame. At that time, the movie Coraline didn't exist, but now I'd say it's a pretty accurate comparison. The similarity between the movie and these events is eerie. This door was made of dark, old wood, the kind of muddy brown that looks almost black, with deep grooves that seemed burned or stained into it. Eventually, I fell back to sleep. Later, when the sun finally came up, I talked to my dad about the tiny door. My sisters and I stayed downstairs while he checked it out. Soon, he called us up to see it. It was a tiny room, more like a storage closet, with a few gallons of water and some firewood inside. Nothing to worry about. Even Grace crawled inside, and Dad took a picture. But the second night is when things really began. I was scared of being frightened again that night, so I asked my dad to leave a light on for me so I could see if I woke up. He didn't like the idea much, so instead, he made a fire in the fireplace and put up the chain guard for extra protection. Then we all went to bed. The fire burned well for several hours. To be honest, I spent more time watching the shadows of the flames dance up the high, triangular ceiling than I did sleeping. I wonder now if I had actually slept, would I have experienced what happened next? Soon, the flames dwindled down to sparks and embers, then to just a faint orange glow. I turned over, now facing that eerie tiny door. As soon as I did, I was startled by a tapping, the same repetitive sound drilling into my mind again. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from in front of me, from behind that door. I thought it was a trick of my mind, maybe just me imagining something. A small branch shaking against the right part of the roof, making the door rattle. There was no way a monster could come after me. I was saved and protected, and monsters aren't real. Then there was silence. I peeked through my cocoon of pillows and blankets, exposing just my eyes. I felt I had to see it to see if it was something or someone. I don't really know what I was thinking as I opened my eyes, but sharp, elongated fingers slowly pulled back between the seams of the door and frame. It somehow slipped through the tiny crack like a shadow. Suddenly, the door started to shake, and a loud scratching noise echoed from the other side. It was so loud that even my sister stirred a bit in bed. I could hear her, or at least I hoped it was her. The noise behind the door masked it, but I felt deep in my soul that there was some movement, some presence behind me. It had to be Bailey. She probably heard it too and was gonna run and tell Dad. I hoped she would. Another scraping sound, like talons catching on layers of wood. Then the fire went out all at once. The orange halo of light that outlined the edges of the room vanished, leaving me in complete darkness. Was my sister there? I swore I could hear movement. I convinced myself that sound was her. Then there was a bang, the door shook violently. By this point, I was so still with fear that my muscles cramped, and my breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. I was probably breathing 20 times a minute, trying not to breathe at all. Another bang. Something behind the door was knocking, hitting it hard, like someone pounding with a fist. Bang! Each time, I felt myself shrivel up, becoming stiffer and stiller, as if I could make myself disappear. Bang! 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 The loud thuds vibrated through the air, my heartbeat matching their rhythm. Would you stop it? Bailey had finally woken up, her words followed by silence. I heard another shift, and my bed moved. Jade, would you? Her words stopped abruptly, followed by a deafening scream. She screamed, but I didn't move. I stayed completely still. It wasn't her that had bumped my bed. It wasn't her who I felt sitting at the edge of my feet. Whatever it was, Bailey had seen it, and it was on my bed, having come from that tiny closet beside me. Tears overflowed, spilling down my face, even though I kept my eyes shut tight. I didn't want to see that door, didn't want to see that thing. Bang! The door was pounded on with the force of a football player trying to break it down. The wood bowed and bent from the immense force behind it. Bang! 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 Something inside me, something beyond my control, made me start reciting Bible verses again, through shaky breaths and tear. The summer after my freshman year of high school, my family decided to take a trip to Yellowstone National Park. We rented a cabin in the woods, just outside the park. I was excited to spend the week surrounded by nature instead of the city, planning to spend most of my time reading on the porch. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, casting shadows across the dirt driveway. My parents and younger sister, Amy, got out of the SUV while I grabbed the bags. The cabin's owner, an elderly man named Walter, came over to greet us. After introducing himself, he led us inside. The cabin was quaint, with wood-paneled walls, patchwork quilts, and a stone fireplace. The musty smell reminded me of my grandparents' basement. Walter showed us around, pointing out the small kitchen, bathroom, and bedrooms. Afterward, he rubbed his hands together and said, "If you need anything, just holler. My house is a mile down the road." As my dad handed him the check for our stay, Walter pocketed it and started to leave, but then paused. He looked at us with a strange expression and said, "One more thing. I suggest you stay inside after dark. These woods aren't right at night, if you know what I mean." My dad laughed awkwardly, saying we were city folks and could manage. Walter nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over each of us. "Just keep the doors locked and curtains drawn after dark," he added before leaving. We stood there, a bit uneasy after his warning, but soon brushed it off. My mom laughed nervously, and my dad tried to reassure us, saying Walter was probably just trying to scare us. We unpacked and settled in, and the odd encounter with Walter soon slipped from my mind as I imagined spending the week on the porch swing with a good book. As the sun began to set, we cooked hot dogs and beans over the fire. I was engrossed in my book when the howls of coyotes echoed in the distance. After dinner, I said goodnight and headed to the room I was sharing with Amy. She was already in bed, so I quietly changed into my pajamas, turned off the lamp, and settled in. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting shadows that swayed with the breeze. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted, and a coyote's cry answered. I was starting to drift off when an eerie sound pierced the night, a drawn-out wail that seemed unnatural. My eyes snapped open, now fully awake. The strange howling sounded again, closer and louder than before, coming from the woods surrounding the cabin. I sat up and glanced at Amy's bed. She appeared to be sleeping soundly. I noticed the curtains were still partly open and thought about closing them, but fear kept me under the covers. The unearthly howling continued sporadically, each cry making my fear grow. I didn't dare look out the window, terrified of what I might see. At some point, I realized Amy was no longer in her bed. How could I not have noticed her get up? I scanned the room, my heart pounding, and saw her standing in the center of the room, staring blankly out the window. I whispered her name, but she didn't respond. I tried again, louder, but she remained frozen, her gaze fixed on something outside. As the cries outside grew louder, I forced myself to get out of bed and approached her. Her face was illuminated by the moonlight, her eyes open but vacant, as if she was in a trance. I followed her gaze out the window but saw nothing but darkness and swaying branches. When the howling grew even louder, I flinched, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I reached for Amy's arm, but before I could touch her, she suddenly turned her head toward me. I stumbled back, startled by the vacant look in her eyes, but then her head snapped back to the window. Panicked, I tried to get her back to bed, and to my relief, she followed without resistance. As we moved away from the window, the howling subsided, replaced by the normal sounds of the night. Once she was back in bed, I watched her face for any sign of awareness, but she remained expressionless, her eyes dull. I told her to try to sleep and closed the curtains, plunging the room into darkness. Exhausted, I crawled back into bed, but sleep was elusive as I lay there, listening to the silence. Eventually, I drifted off, but my sleep was restless, haunted by the sounds and Amy's blank stare. I woke up at dawn, listening intently, but the morning was quiet, with only birds chirping outside. I glanced at Amy's bed and was relieved to see her sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed. As I got dressed, I debated whether to tell my parents about the strange events of the previous night, but I decided to wait and see how Amy acted when she woke up. When Amy finally got up, she seemed her usual self, though a bit groggy. She didn't mention anything about the night before, so I kept quiet too. After breakfast, she watched cartoons while my parents planned the day's activities. I decided to go for a walk and slipped out the front door with a book. The morning sun was warm, and the forest seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of the night before. I wandered aimlessly until I found myself on a deserted dirt road. I followed it until I came across a weathered fence with a no trespassing sign. Curious, I continued down the road, noticing strange claw marks on the trees. The sight made me uneasy, so I turned back toward the cabin. As I walked back, I stumbled into a small clearing where makeshift wooden structures stood, adorned with crude symbols and strange objects. The scene felt dark and foreboding, and I quickly left, feeling like I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I tried to act normal, but I was still on edge. My dad noticed and suggested we stay close to the cabin for the rest of the day. Amy and I exchanged a look, both knowing the cabin wasn't as safe as it seemed. That evening, the atmosphere was tense as we played board games, trying to ignore the approaching night. Once dusk settled, my dad checked the locks and curtains before going to bed. Amy and I lay in our beds, listening to the silence. I considered talking to her about what happened, but was too afraid to speak. Around 1 a.m., the howling started again. I jolted upright, my heart racing. The cries were louder and more intense than the night before. Then, a tall figure passed by our window, blocking the moonlight. I froze, terrified. The silhouette lingered for a moment before moving on, its head turning toward the window. I turned to Amy, who was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. She was trembling, clutching her ears as if trying to block out the sounds. I rushed to her and held her, trying to calm her down. After a while, she stopped struggling and went still, but the fear in her eyes remained. The howling eventually faded, and exhaustion overtook me. I fell asleep, only to be startled awake later by the sound of the doorknob rattling. Something was trying to get into our room. I held my breath as the knob twisted, but the door stayed closed. After a minute, the rattling stopped, and I heard footsteps moving down the hall. The front door creaked open, and then the footsteps faded away. The next morning, we packed up and left as soon as the sun rose. My dad was pale, and my mom was on the verge of tears. Amy was silent, her gaze distant. We all knew something terrible had happened, and we needed to leave. The drive home was quiet. Amy slept fitfully in the back seat while I stared out the window, my mind racing with questions. What were those creatures, and why did they target us? What would have happened if they had gotten into our rooms? The days after we returned home were a blur. Amy stayed in her room, plagued by nightmares. My parents tried to comfort her, but we all knew something had changed. About a week later, I saw Amy leaving the house with a determined look on her face. I followed her as she wound through the streets, eventually reaching an abandoned warehouse. She pulled out a lighter and threw it through a broken window. Flames quickly engulfed the building, and I realized that whatever had happened to her at the cabin was far from over. One autumn evening, My friend and I found ourselves in the middle of a spooky night deep within the woods. My friend's family owned a cabin, a long, narrow house with no nearby neighbors for miles. We decided to do something scary, play with a Ouija board. It was around 11:30 to midnight, and the darkness surrounded us as we gathered around the board, hoping to make contact with the supernatural. To our surprise, the planchette moved and spelled out the name Austin, who was my friend's boyfriend. The air grew tense as we continued to ask the spirit what it wanted. It slowly spelled out a message that made our unease grow even more. The board revealed something terrifying. For some reason, the spirit wanted to harm Austin. It spelled out DIE, sending chills down our spines. We quickly ended the session and said our goodbyes. Despite the disturbing experience, we were eager for more supernatural encounters, so we came up with a plan. We decided to leave a note under the door of an empty room in the house, hoping for a response from any spirits. To our shock, someone or something wrote back. The message once again expressed hatred towards Austin. Alarmed, we decided to cleanse the cabin, hoping to get rid of any negative energy. It was clear that whatever spirit or spirits were there had bad intentions. Around 3:15 to 3:30 a.m., I decided to leave the creepy cabin. My friend walked me to my car, which was parked only about 30 feet away from the porch. As I started driving, I reached a crossroads about 4 miles down the road when my phone suddenly vibrated. It was a video call from my friend. Their voice was shaky, and they strangely asked if I had come back. "No," I said. "I've been gone for a while now, and I'm already about 4 miles down the road." To my shock, my friend told me they could hear my voice right outside the front door, asking to be let in. In disbelief, I showed them that I was still in my car at the crossroads, far away from them. My friend moved their phone near the front door so I could hear the voice. To my horror, it was an eerie imitation of my own voice, begging to be let inside. The voice insisted there was some kind of danger outside and that a monster would get them if they didn't let me in. Terrified, my friend refused to open the door. The voice outside grew more aggressive and threatening, and it seemed like there were multiple voices all screaming at once. The imitation of my voice then tried to lure my friend into the dark woods, still mimicking my voice and crying out for help. I sat frozen in my car, helplessly listening to the entire terrifying exchange through my car's speakers. Eventually, the voices faded away, leaving us both confused and scared. To this day, we don't know what that was, but we believe it happened because we dared to mess with the Ouija board. This is a story that happened to me and my family during a summer vacation. We were on holiday in Scotland, staying at our large lodge, which we visit every year. The lodge is close to a hotel, so we often walk over to use its facilities, especially the pool. On the 4th day of swimming, we noticed a strange-looking man wearing goggles. He kept diving underwater repeatedly. This man seemed to be in his early 30s. To give you a clearer picture, my family consists of me, my 16-year-old sister Mia, my other 10-year-old sister Martha, my aunt, and my parents. The man started swimming very close to us, making us uncomfortable. My mom signaled us to keep away from him, but he kept moving toward us, so we decided to leave the pool. When I entered the changing rooms, my heart sank as I noticed the same man following me inside. My dad had already left, so I quickly dressed and exited. As we gathered outside the hotel, my little sister needed to use the bathroom. But as she headed towards it, we saw the same man from the pool lingering near the girl's room. My mom went with her since she was unnerved by the man's presence. While in the bathroom, a woman in her mid-40s entered and stood in a cubicle with the door wide open, staring at my mom for about 10 seconds before closing the door. After this unsettling incident, we walked back to the lodge, but noticed the same woman following us from a short distance. Our paths diverged, but eventually converged again. From the safety of our lodge, we watched her wander aimlessly between lodges before she turned and started walking toward ours. Then, she walked behind the lodge next to ours and disappeared into the forest behind it. One thing to mention is that no one ever goes into those woods behind the lodges, as they seem to be off-limits. Later that night, while we were watching TV, my older sister, whose room faced the woods, heard loud knocking on her window. She came to tell us, and I went to open the curtains for her. It was pitch dark outside, and I couldn't see anything except the faint outlines of trees. We checked outside with flashlights, and my aunt claimed to have found 2 sets of footprints leading away and disappearing into the trees. As we called it a night, my dad and I went outside one last time to be sure everything was safe. To our surprise, we noticed people in nearby lodges opening their curtains and looking around outside as well. Suddenly, we heard a helicopter flying low over the lodges. It was a police helicopter, and they seemed to be searching for someone. My dad and I quickly went back inside and locked the doors. We placed a jar on top of the door handle so that if anyone tried to open it, the jar would fall and alert us. The next day, as we were getting ready to leave, it was our last day there. The house cleaner came by and told us about a break-in that had occurred at the lodge right next to ours. Disturbingly, it wasn't just a break-in. The people staying in that lodge had been found brutally stabbed to death. The cleaner said that a man and a woman had been watching the lodges, seemingly deciding which one to target. But if they were just burglars, why did they need to kill those people? My family and I still wonder about that man and woman, and although it sounds grim, we feel fortunate that it wasn't our lodge they chose to break into.